So welcome everyone. I'm going to present the keynote speech by Ian Parker, who came from all the way from UK to participate in the festival. Thank you so much for coming. So the name of his speech is The Psy-Professions, Pathology and Alternatives. But before Ian begins, I'm going to read a short brief introduction about him. So, Ian Parker is one of the most important contemporary critics of the discipline of psychology. A prolific writer with over 25 books to his name, he has a formidable reputation in the fields of critical psychology, Marxist psychology, and psychoanalytic theory. He is a fellow of the British Psychological Society, Emeritus Professor at the University of Leicester, and the managing editor of the Annual Review of Critical Psychology journal. Parker is also a practicing psychoanalyst and a member of the Center of Freudian Analysis and Research at the London Society of the New Lacanian School. So no, not anymore.
I resigned from the New Lacanian School because of their transphobia.
Okay. Thank you for a very important correction. So without further ado, microphone to you. And there will be 50 minutes for general discussion and questions after the 45-minute speech.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really great to be here, and also to be here to hear the discussion about disability earlier. There are some important intersectional connections between radical health practice and work on disability, and also the introduction about Ukraine solidarity, which I think is incredibly important and raises a lot of questions about the role of psychology in our solidarity work. I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, I'm going to talk a bit about distress. And I talk about distress because I don't really want to talk about mental illness, because that's a medical, psychiatric way of framing what we experience in this horrible, miserable world today. A medical, psychiatric way of understanding our distress leads us down a particular road to treatment which has lots of problems, and I'll talk a little bit more about those problems later. And I use distress in a very general way to understand our difficulty of living in this world, rather than talk about mental distress or emotional distress, because the distress that we feel is also in our relationships and in our bodies. As we've heard from the previous talk in relation to what is called PTSD, for example, it is a bodily distress. And I think we have to think about how this society divides what we think about from what we feel. It divides the mind from the body in a very problematic way. I'm also going to talk about the psy-professions. And by the psy-professions, I mean the network of different approaches to understanding the mind that include psychiatry and psychology, thank you, and psychotherapy, all of those things that have the psy at the beginning of it. The psy-professions present themselves as having some expertise about how other people think. And often that expertise is about the other people who are different from the professionals. I've spent most of my life practicing and teaching, insisting that the distress that we feel is a distress that is felt by the professionals as well. And we need to take that seriously. And then I'm going to talk about some alternatives to the psy-professions. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about distress. We live in a world that creates distress. We can't say that everything that we experience is caused by this society, because everyone has their own individual separate responses to life in this society that vary from group to group and from individual to individual. But there are some general conditions that make it difficult for us to survive in this society. And one is individualism, the individualization of our experience, so that we're separated from each other. And when we feel unhappy or unable to cope, that individualism drives us into thinking that we are responsible for that feeling and that we must deal with it on our own. That it isn't a product of social relationships, but it's a product of something that is inside us as individuals. And that individualism is reinforced today under conditions of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism strips back the welfare and support functions of the state, so we no longer have that collective support. It tells us that we are responsible for our problems and responsible for finding work and responsible for looking after ourselves and looking after our families. And very importantly, neoliberalism institutes police processes, coercion that enforce individual solutions to what should be social problems and social solutions. And there are general issues that we have to confront in this society of commodification, the ways in which our experiences are turned into things, our experiences of happiness are turned into objects to be marketed in the media and turned into things to be bought and sold, and reification, so that we are treated like objects, and we come to treat ourselves like objects as well. And that causes all kinds of problems for the way that we think about ourselves and our emotions and our lives and our relationships. And we suffer generally in this society from alienation, deep alienation that has at least 4 different aspects. First of all, for those of us who work, and we all work in some way or another, when we're forced to sell our labor time to others, that creativity, that creative labor that we engage in is taken away from us because we have no control over the things that we're producing. And we are separated from our creative work. The objects that we produce, whether they're physical objects in the factories or whether they're software objects, virtual objects, if we're working in that kind of media, whatever kind of object it is, whether it's in care work, where we're looking after other people in a hospital or a mental institution, that creative support and creative labor that we engage in is ripped away from us and turned into an object that is sold for profit by someone else who controls our labor. So there's that kind of alienation, that kind of separation. There's also separation from each other in this society where we're forced to compete. We're forced to compete for work. We're forced to compete for resources. And that causes us to treat other people like threatening objects, things that might take away our ability to work. And we are separated from our own bodies, our own bodily nature. We come to think of our bodies as things that have to be taken to work. We have to take our bodies to work every day. If we don't do that, we won't be able to make money and we won't be able to survive. And so our own bodies become objects of suspicion and fear. And other people's bodies, when they are sick bodies, are also become objects of fear and suspicion. And so we have a separation from our bodies that makes us also suspicious and fearful of other people who are disabled, who are then treated as reminders of our own vulnerability. And there's a separation, a very deadly separation between those of us who think we are well and those others who we see as being sick and different from us. And there's also another aspect, a 4th aspect of this alienation, which is that we're separated from nature as such. We come to see nature as something that is untamed, something that has to be controlled, something that is threatening. And so we develop a very deadly and destructive relationship with nature, which means that we are engaged in exploiting nature instead of being part of it. So these forms of alienation then lead to different kinds of distress and problems of living with each other. Now let us move on to the ways in which the psy-professions deal with this. I've mentioned that the psy-professions consist of different kinds of professional approaches, and the psy-complex is a network of approaches to mental health, the mainstream approaches to mental health that are there around us in the hospitals, in the clinics, they're there in the schools. We find them in the prisons, where the prisoners are told to take care of themselves and take responsibility for the distress that they feel at being locked up. We see it in industry, and in fact, the discipline of psychology first emerged in industry in order to get people to work faster and more efficiently. And we see it in welfare services and also in advice, not only in the official advice, but also in popular advice columns and the televisions, the magazines. Now, the most important and most powerful profession in the psy-professions is psychiatry. And interestingly, psychiatry developed its main force after the Second World War. There were mental asylums, very powerful mental asylums before the First World War. There were mental asylums before the First World War, but psychiatry really got going as a medical discipline with the attempt to deal with shell shock, what now is named PTSD. And so there's an immediate connection with the issues that the comrade was raising in the last session. And what psychiatry did was to try and find a biological basis for shell shock, instead of looking at the conditions of war and the carnage that was caused in the First World War, and to look at the underlying biological conditions, and then to find out which kind of bodies were more susceptible to shell shock and PTSD than other kinds of bodies, to engage in a kind of classification and surveillance and segregation of populations, so that certain kinds of people were seen as the ones that will suffer from shell shock and PTSD, and the normal people will be the ones who are resilient and able to survive. And as we heard from the comrade before, we can never tell how that shell shock, how that PTSD is going to hit us. And it could hit any of us at any time. And it hits many of us in different ways at different times of our lives, whether we're fighting in a war or whether we're undergoing terrible conditions in the factory, at work, or at home in those conditions. And we have different traditions in psychiatry. We have a tradition in psychiatry which is the German tradition, and it's the German tradition that then gave rise to the main Bible of the psychiatric profession, which is the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And as its name tells you very clearly, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is about understanding the prevalence of different kinds of disorder in different kinds of person in the population. And so the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, increasingly developed the number of categories in its listing of disorders. and then tries to fit people into those categories when they come to the psychiatrist for help. So they look for symptoms of underlying disease entities that are named in the DSM. So there's a medical assumption here, and psychiatrists are trained, first of all, as medical doctors, then they undergo their training as psychiatrists, and so they carry that medical understanding of distress with them, and they treat the different ways in which we suffer, the different forms of distress that we suffer, as being underlying medical, biological problems. That's the mainstream German tradition. There's another tradition of psychiatry in the French tradition, which is more concerned with different kinds of mental structures that we carry around with us, neurotic or other kinds of mental structures, which don't rely so much on symptoms, but still is very much locked into the medical model. Now, there have been some very interesting alternatives from within psychiatry, one of which was a wonderful book published in 2009 called The Myth of the Chemical Cure by Joanna Moncrief, who is a psychiatrist and has been working with us for many years in this magazine, Asylum, which is the magazine for democratic psychiatry, now named the magazine for radical mental health. And I'll leave some copies of this magazine in the Zine area so that you can have a look at it. And what Joanna Moncrief argues in The Myth of the Chemical Cure is that disorders are not a function of biology, but, and this is very important, different kinds of medication do have profound effects. And she puts it this way. If you think of the way of what happens to your body when you smoke a cigarette or you take alcohol, it does produce changes in your body. It produces changes in your body that may make you more agitated. It may make you more relaxed. It will vary from person to person. If I smoke a cigarette, I will feel sick and vomit, for example. But if I drink some alcohol, I'll feel relaxed. And if I drink too much alcohol, I'll get abusive and unhappy. But these chemicals have profound effects on us, and they can be useful in helping us to cope at times of distress. Cigarettes and alcohol can be useful as chemical management vehicles for us to cope with our distress. And the same applies with psychiatric medication. And Joanna Moncrief's argument is that psychiatric medication always operates in this kind of way. Psychiatric medication does not rebalance the mind. It does not put things right in the brain. But all kinds of psychiatric medication do different things to us. Now, there are important consequences of this argument, because it means that we don't hand over control to the psychiatrist to tell us what the medication will do to us, but we need to discuss with each other what the medication is doing and to find out which forms of medication are useful and which forms of medication are problematic for us. In the same way as we discover which kinds of cigarette or which kinds of alcohol are useful for us and which kinds are not. Okay, psychiatry rules the roost. That is, psychiatry is the master of the psy-professions. And in multidisciplinary teams, it's the psychiatrist who is in control, and other kinds of psy-professional are really on a lesser footing and usually have to do what the psychiatrist tells them. But of course, there is psychology. And psychologists are usually not medically trained, but psychologists are involved in a kind of battle with the psychiatrists, where they like to have their own expertise. And their main expertise at the moment is in cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. There are many different kinds of psychology, but CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, is the main one at the moment. And it has two components, as the name suggests. There is a behavioral component, where the psychologists will observe what kind of behavior you're showing them when you come to talk about your distress. And there's the cognitive component, which is the way that you think about what has happened to you. And the task of the psychologist is basically to work out what behaviors are good and what behaviors are bad, what kind of behaviors are adaptive and what kind of behaviors are maladaptive, and to change the way that you think about it. Not to change your social relationships, not to change the social conditions, not to ask questions about what oppression and exploitation is in this world, but to change the way that you think about it so that you can fit better into this world and be a good citizen and a good worker. Now, there are nice psychologists, and I know there are some nice psychologists here. And those psychologists try and do this cognitive behavioral therapy in a nicer kind of way. And they struggle against the part of the psy-profession that has trained them. But it's an uphill struggle. And they have a lot of problems in trying to be nice while they're having to implement CBT. Now, the third aspect of the psy-professions that I want to mention is psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is about healing internal splits in the individual and learning what you can change and what you can't change. Psychotherapy offers some alternatives that are really useful, but the underlying assumption in most forms of psychotherapy is very similar to that of psychology, that it is down to the individual to heal themselves and to talk about their problems to a professional and to find a solution which will enable them to feel happier in this very, very unhappy world. Very briefly, the fourth main player in the psy-professions is psychoanalysis, and that is the kind of approach that I've been working with for many years. And I have to say that although I do practice as a psychoanalyst and I try to do it in a nicer way, there are very severe limitations in psychoanalysis at all. First of all, psychoanalysis doesn't present you with the vision that you will end up being a happy person. In fact, psychoanalysis is an approach that helps you to live with unconscious processes rather than to dissolve them. So we're all, in some ways, unhappy in this world, and that leads psychoanalysis as a profession to be quite pessimistic about the possibility of building a world in which we can collectively share for each other and in which we actually all can feel creative and productive and happy. And the watchword of psychoanalysis is that you transform hysterical misery into ordinary unhappiness. And I suppose that says it all. But as far as I'm concerned, it can be useful in helping people to come to terms with why things have happened to them and to look a little more deeply into that set of personal historical circumstances. But for the purposes of this talk today, we have to acknowledge that there are some severe problems in psychoanalysis as well as in the other psy-professions. I want to move on to some alternatives. And the alternatives include, Oh, I want to go back, but I can't go back because something's happened to the laptop. But it doesn't matter. I'm going to be talking about a number of different alternatives. And in the alternatives that we have, usually if we're doing a psychology degree, there are three alternatives that are presented to us in the psychology textbooks. One is the work of R.D. Laing, who was a Scottish psychiatrist who tried to understand the existential underlying deep reasons why people are distressed in this society. And although he was trained as a psychiatrist and also actually trained as a psychoanalyst, R.D. Laing launched a very deep critique of the medical model in psychiatry, which tells us that the problem is not underlying biological problems, but the problem is how we make sense of our lives. So the task is to give people a space, a genuine space of safety so that they can work through their problems. So that's one alternative approach that's spoken about in the psychology textbooks. The second approach is Thomas Szasz. Thomas Szasz was an American psychiatrist who turned against the medical model. But we have to know something about Thomas Szasz that is very important, which is while R.D. Laing worked on the left and saw a left-wing solution to social problems as a problem of dealing with psychiatric issues, Thomas Szasz came at the issue from the right. From the right. He was a right-wing libertarian. So he wanted to dissolve the medical model and get people to take responsibility for their problems very much in the spirit of neoliberalism. So it's very much a mystery to me sometimes why Thomas Szasz is seen as being a progressive figure. Yes, he made some good critiques of the medical model in psychiatry, but his solution was a right-wing individualist solution. The third figure is Irving Goffman, who shows how the asylums demand a certain kind of behavior from us. The mental hospitals demand that you behave in a certain kind of way, which confirms the diagnoses given to you by the psychiatrists. Very useful sociological model. And usually the psychology textbooks stop at that. But there are two other alternatives among the usual suspects that I want to mention that are important. The first is Kate Millett, the feminist who was one of the key figures in the feminist movement in the 1960s and 1970s, who put her finger on an important cause of distress, not only for women, but for anyone who is forced to be normal in this abnormal world. And she pointed out that heteropatriarchy has deep consequences for women, and that most of the psy-professions, most of the time, are perniciously and dangerously sexist, blaming women for their distress and leading women to be given psychological and psychiatric treatments, more likely to be given medication, more likely to be given electroshock, physical treatments that will make them feel worse and lead them into a spiral of misery in the mental hospitals and in the mental health system. So she drew attention to the importance of sexism in the psy-professions as well as sexism in society. And the other figure is Frantz Fanon, who was trained as a psychiatrist. He was from Martinique and trained as a psychiatrist before developing very important critiques of psychiatry and the society that gives us psychiatry, focusing on colonialism and looking at the depth of racism and racist oppression that have an effect on all of us. And what Fanon showed us was not only that black people and people from ethnic minorities suffer from higher levels of mental distress and are labelled as suffering from mental distress and are put in the mental hospitals at a much higher rate than the normal white people in white Western societies. But also that this racism is internalized. It's internalized by people from ethnic minorities. It's internalized by black people, so that they do actually become more distressed and less able to fight back. Frantz Fanon worked with the National Liberation Movement in Algeria, which was fighting the French occupation through the late 1950s and early 1960s, and turned to a political solution to mental distress, a collective solution that would help people to become empowered and able to fight racism and colonial oppression. Okay, what about practical solutions? Well, one of the first solutions that is very important, and it's a solution that led us to set up this magazine, Asylum Magazine, in 1986. One of the very interesting alternatives to the medical model and the psy-professions, was founded in the northeast Italian city of Trieste in the 1970s. The Trieste experiment was led by a psychiatrist, as these alternatives so often are, a psychiatrist who was trained in the medical model and then realized that it was doing more damage than help, and became director of the mental hospital in Trieste, mental hospital that was called San Giovanni. And when he became the director of the mental hospital, he set about the task of closing it. He wanted to close the mental hospital, and in place of the old asylum, the old mental hospital of San Giovanni, he wanted to build a network of community health centers that would give support to people instead of imprisoning people. And to do that, Franco Basaglia had to build a movement, a political movement. The most important changes in and against psychiatry come about through political movements. They don't come about through professional debates and changes in the diagnostic systems. You only have to look back, to give one example, to 1973, where the American Psychiatric Association decided that homosexuality was not a mental disorder. It was not a mental disease. And they decided that in 1973 by a vote. Not by medical evidence, but by a vote that was demanded and pushed for by the gay liberation movement. That it was lesbian and gay activists actively demonstrating, disrupting psychiatric meetings, demanding that their experiences be taken seriously, that they not be pathologized, that led to the American Psychiatric Association deciding that homosexuality was not a disease. And the same happened in Trieste in the 1970s. There was a movement that was built called Psychiatria Democratica, or democratic psychiatry. Psychiatria Democratica was a movement of hundreds of thousands of people across Italy that brought together the left and the feminist and alternative movements to demand that the mental hospitals be closed. They've brought about a petition to Parliament, the Italian Parliament, demanding that the mental hospitals as places of imprisonment should be closed. And very quickly, when it became clear that Psychiatria Democratica was going to succeed in getting this referendum passed, the Parliament very quickly passed a law, Law 180. And Law 180, which was passed in 1978, closed or led the way to the closure of some of the mental hospitals. Most importantly, it led to the closure of the San Giovanni Mental Hospital in Trieste, in the northeast of Italy. That is up on the border with what is now Slovenia. The closure of that mental hospital was really important. There were some long-term patients of the mental hospital who were unable to cope in the world outside, and so they had to think about how they could give support to those people. But most people were released from the mental hospital, and instead you had a clinic that would provide support for people who went and asked for it, and mental health centres around the city of Trieste. One of the important mental health centres today is called the Centre Frantz Fanon, after the black anti-racist psychiatrist. It's a link, a very important link that is made between the reforms in Trieste and other forms of social movement. And if you go to Trieste today, you can visit the mental health centres and you'll find something very interesting. One is that they still get funding from the European Union, and in order to get their funding, they have to fill out the forms telling what diagnosis they have made of the people that they see, and so what kind of medication they're giving. Now, these diagnoses are written down after the encounter with people simply for bureaucratic reasons. That is, the diagnoses do not lead to medication. That's the first thing, which is really important. That is, they're conforming. The psychiatrists who are still working in Trieste are radical psychiatrists who are working inside the system and working against the system in order to get the funding from the European Union. I've got 10 minutes left. And they're doing that knowing that they don't believe in the medical model at all. And the second is the way that they use medication. They don't pretend that the medication will bring about a cure. That is, the line that they take is very similar to the line that I described earlier in the book, The Myth of the Chemical Cure. That is, psychiatric medication has effects. It may calm people down, and if people come in and they need medication to calm them down, that medication is used as a temporary measure and used in the context of other forms of support and discussion among the people who are taking the medication, so they can discover which medication is good for them and which kind of medication makes them worse. That it is the patients who are in control of the decisions, finally, rather than the psychiatrists. So the Trieste model is a really important model as an alternative, and it, as I said earlier, it was one of the inspirations for the founding of the Asylum magazine, which brings together users of psychiatric services, people who work as professionals in one of the psy-professions, who are in solidarity with the patients, with the users of psychiatric services, and radical academics. Those three groups come together and produce Asylum magazine. So you'll have articles written by people who are inside mental hospitals, speaking about their experiences, speaking about their experiences of medication, speaking about the terrible treatments that they've been given, and discussing alternatives. The second really important alternative is the Hearing Voices Network. Hearing voices in most Western societies is seen as being a deep sign of a problem. It's seen as a symptom. To hear voices is labelled by the DSM, by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, by the Bible of the psychiatrists, hearing voices is labeled by the DSM as a first-rank symptom of schizophrenia. So if you go to a psychiatrist and you tell them that you hear voices, then you are likely to be put on medication. It's very possible that you'll be locked up in a psychiatric hospital if you continue to hear voices and you deny that there's a problem. And that intensifies the distress that people hear if they are distressed when they hear voices. But not everyone who hears voices is distressed by that experience. And it was a very important event back in the 1980s, where another psychiatrist, a psychiatrist who saw that there was something wrong with the system, this time it was a Dutch psychiatrist in the Netherlands called Marius Romme. Marius Romme, a psychiatrist, was talking to one of his patients one day. Her name was Patsy Hager. Patsy Hager said to Marius Romme, "Okay, you tell me that I hear voices, and you tell me that I have a psychiatric problem. But I know that you, Marius Romme, I know that you're a Catholic. I know that you believe in God, and surely you must hear the voice of God as part of your experience as being a good Christian." At that moment, it was like a light bulb moment for Marius Romme. Of course, Patsy Hager, you're absolutely right. Lots of people hear voices for different reasons. And the problem is not the hearing of voices, but the problem is the isolation of people who are given medical diagnoses when they hear the voices, or their sense of being out of control, or their sense of fear, because they hear so much around them about hearing voices as a problem. It's something that is abnormal. It's a sign of schizophrenia. You must be mad if you hear voices. So what Marius Romme and a journalist called Sandra Escher and Patsy Hager did was put out a call on Dutch television for people who hear voices to come together and share their experiences. And they found very interesting thing, that there were lots and lots of people who discussed their experiences of hearing voices who were not on medication. Some of them hadn't told anyone else because they were frightened of being labeled schizophrenic. Many of them had kept away from psychiatrists. But from that developed the Hearing Voices Network. The Hearing Voices Network is a form of support where people can share their experiences of hearing voices and discuss what is useful for them. For some people who are distressed, maybe they might take medication. For some people who want a way of living away from the voices, they might use cognitive behavioral techniques. Yes. They might, for example, engage in a technique where they decide that they will listen to their voices between 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the evening, and they won't listen to the voices at other times. They may wear headphones so that they can talk aloud, and it's as if they're talking on a phone to somebody, but it becomes normal. They're not treated as abnormal. They can walk around listening to the voices and talking back to the voices and live in this society in that kind of way. We had a conference in the university where I was teaching in 1995 in Manchester, where we asked people to put forward their different theories of hearing voices. We had some psychiatrists. We allowed them to speak. We had some clinical psychologists. We allowed them to speak as well. But most importantly, we had people who heard voices talking about their experiences. One of the talks that I always remember was given by a shaman who came dressed looking like a bank manager in a suit. And he told us, looking at his notebook, he told us that he could hear the voices in the people in the room next door. that he could hear the voices of the people in the next city, that he could hear the voices of people on other planets. He could hear the voices of starship captains. He could hear voices from other universes. He could not only hear the voices, but he could see things, and he could create things. He could bring things out of those other universes, and he could bring things into this universe and show them to us. And he said at the end of his talk, anyone can do this, and I can show you how. Well, the time came to the end. It was the end of his talk, and so we never learnt how we could do this. But what we did learn is that this person had an experience of living in the world that was very different from us. And he was able to walk around the world and live in the world and talk about his experiences. And this was one of the places where he was able to do that. The conference didn't end marvelously. I have to say that the conference ended in a little bit of disorder because there were arguments between supporters of two different spiritualist churches who had different arguments for whether you hear voices when there's something wrong or whether you hear voices all the time and they're spirit guides. But it actually was a lesson that we learned, was that we have to find other places where people can share these experiences and learn to listen and learn that there are many different ways of being in the world. And it's especially important. It comes down, again, to a question of racism. Very important when we have people coming from other countries, when we have people in Britain, for example, we have many people coming from the Caribbean. Many people coming from the Caribbean are members of Pentecostalist religions, and it is a part of their faith that they hear the voices of spirits and they speak back to the spirits as part of their faith. Now, if these people go in front of psychiatrists in Britain, very often they end up in psychiatric hospital, and that's why we have a four times the incarceration of black people in mental hospitals in Britain today, because kinds of experiences that people bring to the psychiatrist are pathologized. We have to find other ways of living together and taking our experiences, different experiences, seriously. Another initiative that I want to mention. Okay, we're winding up now, so I'll do this very, very quickly in 1 minute. Is first of all the Red Clinic. The Red Clinic is a collection of people that I'm part of that attempts to take forward the work of the free clinics in Budapest, Vienna, and Berlin before the Second World War. And this is where there is a radical tradition in psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis today, not only does it individualize distress, but most forms of psychoanalysis demand money. It's a private treatment. So what we try to do is go back into the history of psychoanalysis, because we discovered that there were free clinics funded by the psychoanalysts before the Second World War in Budapest and Berlin and Vienna. And so we're trying to build free clinics and support people to get free treatment. And one of the important things that we do as part of the Red Clinic is to give support to people in conditions where they're trying to work as psychotherapists in difficult conditions. For example, we have two Arabic-speaking groups in Palestine, Palestinian psychotherapists who are working under the occupation in Israel and Palestine. The Palestinian psychotherapists need space to be able to talk about their work, which is outside of the control of the Israeli state and is in tune with the liberation movement in Palestine. So there's a political connection that we're making in this work. In this work, I want to mention Shy Radicals, which is one of the groupings that is inside Asylum magazine, which points out that in this world we're expected to be very lively and noisy, and to be lively and noisy and happy is the way to be normal. What the Shy Radicals point out is for those of us who are introverts, this is a very difficult world to live in. A noisy, horrible, brash place. And we need to find places where the introverts can live safely and peacefully. And finally, a recent book that was just been published that you can find online, a free PDF is online, is the ways in which those of us in the left and feminist and lesbian and gay and disability activist movements have difficulties in living in this world, not only because we're isolated, as everyone is in this society, but because we're additionally isolated and marginalized. We need spaces like this in order to speak to each other and feel a sense of solidarity and commitment and empowerment. And what the Left Alone book does, it gives lots of examples of ways in which people work together in order to combat the isolation and marginalization that we radicals feel in this world, so that we can better support other people who are suffering from distress and build a social movement that can build a better world in which there is no distress at all. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ian. Very inspiring and provocative speech. Who would like to comment? I would like to try to make it as horizontal as possible. So I think we can all discuss what was said. So you can comment, give your not only questions to Ian, which you can do as well, but also just say what you think about what was said, or maybe have some ideas relevant to what was presented now. So any hands? Just see one hand for now. And once you come, please, if you want to say something, just come to the middle and speak to the microphone.
Thank you very much, Ian. Just wanted to ask, how do you see the tendency, having witnessed neoliberal Margaret Thatcher effect on British society, how do they deal with distress before and after? Of course, the general tendency, I'm not, I know it's a very common question, but overall, thank you.
Well, one of the things that Margaret Thatcher told us was that there's no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women and their families. Yeah? So it's actually one of the arguments for neoliberalism. Everything is down to you and your family. And one consequence that we saw from the 1980s, and I saw this because I was teaching psychology in a university at the time, is the huge increase in the number of people wanting to come in and study psychology. Now, that posed us with a question. We're interested in psychology, but I always defined myself as being an anti-psychologist. Right? That's the way that I think of myself. Not a psychologist, I'm an anti-psychologist, because I want to find alternatives, including alternatives to psychology. And so that posed questions for us of how to engage in a dialogue with people who wanted to understand about psychology. Maybe they wanted to train to be a psychotherapist. Maybe they discovered psychoanalysis and they wanted to go into psychoanalysis. How could we engage in a dialogue with them that would open up this realm of debate? And one of the ways that we tried to do that was to say, Do you know where psychology comes from? It comes from everybody's commonsensical ideas about this society, commonsensical ideological ideas about how people are separate, how certain people are pathological, how certain people have biological causes of their distress. And what psychology and psychiatry does is take these common sense ideological ideas and turn them into something that they claim is scientific. So what we need to do is open things up and engage other people who are not psychologists as the dialogue. So you're interested in psychology, but let's carry on talking to people who you think are not psychologists. Open up the variety of ways and variety of theories that people have about what it is to be human. It's a form of, let's put it in kind of academic terms, deconstruction. It's a deconstruction by involving other people in the debate. So that's the way, one of the ways that we try to deal with this increasing psychologization that appeared during neoliberalism. We saw it under Margaret Thatcher, and I'm sure that you saw it in other places around the world. Well, I know you did.
Thank you. Any more? Please come here, okay? Because it's being recorded.
Thank you very much. My question, should I stay here? Okay. All right. My question is regarding psychoanalysis, because you just kind of glossed it over, kind of, saying that it has some, problems. So that would be interesting to hear about the problems. I guess the one of them is, of course, the transaction of the kind of monetary transaction. But on the other hand, I'm kind of shocked, as you said, was it 73 or something, that the psychiatrists in the United States decided that, through a vote, that homosexuality, for example, is not some sort of disease or mental distress. But I'm shocked because in 1905, Freud wrote the Three Essays on Sexuality, and already there, his argument is that it's not a disease, it's not. So is this project in some sense trying to bring psychoanalysis to a more communal setting? I mean, Reich, for example, or something. Is that an inspiration for this, for the movement that you're, I would say, advocating? So thank you.
Oh, okay, well, first the good news is yes, you're right. I think if you read Freud and the early psychoanalysts properly, correctly, then you will find arguments about diverse gender identity and diverse sexuality there. That there's no strict division between what is normal and what is abnormal in psychoanalysis. We are all, in our own strange ways, abnormal. That's what makes us human. And that's the good news. But the bad news is that actually psychoanalysis was later in challenging heterosexism and homophobia than the psychiatrists. Even after 1973, I went to a radical psychoanalysis conference in 1995, and they were discussing recent arguments by two lesbian activists who were arguing that the British Psychoanalytical Society was still excluding lesbians and gay men from training. It was true. They were excluding them. And they were excluding them on the basis that they must be pathological and they hadn't worked through, all of their pathology in order to become psychoanalysts. And it took years and years of campaigning for the psychoanalytic societies to open up to lesbian and gay experience. Today, well, I'm talking about in Britain today, there's been a horrible alliance between two of the main psychoanalytic traditions. That's why I mentioned that I'd resigned from one of the societies earlier, around transphobia. trans people are still seeing as being the other, still seeing as being the abnormal. And so it's an important part of our activity in the Red Clinic, not only to provide free clinics, but also to combat racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia. That's an important part of our work. Now, practically, what we learn from most in the world is from Brazil. In Brazil, there are existing free clinics in the favelas, in the poor communities, that radical psychoanalysts will go and listen to people. Of course, there's much more psychoanalysis in Brazil than there is in Britain, and probably more than there is in Lithuania. But in Brazil, where there's lots of psychoanalysis, there are lots of radical psychoanalysts who go and provide the free treatment, inclusive, open treatment. And we are learning from that in order to build our work as the Red Clinic. But it's, in terms of the psychoanalytic institutions, is a battle, is a battle.
Hello. There is such a term like punitive psychiatry, and it's about like using the psychiatry as a means to punish people which are too abnormal for some reasons. And from your speech and from broader whatever life experience, I have such a feeling that the whole psychiatry is somehow punitive. That if you get to the appointment with a psychiatrist, then you are already somehow like really guilty, and there is a presumption of being sick if you ended up in the this like session with psychiatrist, and then they would put you into some sort of a cell, like to correct, like to as like with as with committing a crime. So you need somehow to be put back to norm. So do you feel it is this is like a feeling that I have? Do you feel the same, that the psychiatry somehow in that field, or it's not that?
Yeah, my feeling is that you're right. And but there's a debate about this. My feeling is that you're right, and we could see it very, very clearly in the Soviet Union, where psychiatry was used as a tool of oppression. That dissidents were labeled as having different kinds of schizophrenia, which led them to be oppositional to the system. It was used explicitly in that kind of way. And that led some of the Western psychiatric organizations to complain at the activity of the Russian psychiatrists for being oppressive. And what they failed to notice was the same kind of thing was happening in their own countries. And we have to take seriously that level of repression, that level of oppression that happens inside the mental hospitals. But in the same way as there are nice psychologists, I have to also acknowledge that there are people who have undergone psychiatric training who are trying to do progressive things inside the psychiatric system. Most of the radical initiatives that I've been talking about come from psychiatrists. They're people from inside the system who notice that something is wrong, whether that's R.D. Laing or Thomas Sass or Marius Romer, and there are countless others. And we have to engage in a dialogue with those people in order to open up the contradictions in psychiatry. So at the moment in Britain, for example, there's a group called the Critical Psychiatry Network. The Critical Psychiatry Network is just psychiatrists who are arguing against the medical model, and it's in that context that the book I talked about, The Myth of the Chemical Cure, was produced. That it's an internal battle in psychiatry to try and dismantle psychiatry. But, there's a battle everywhere. There's a battle everywhere, and we have to be making alliances with with people, whatever the contradictions are in whatever kind of system it is we're up against. We're not going to win in this world unless we break the power of the state, and we can win over many, many people who in different ways are working with the state apparatuses. And I think the same applies in relation to the psychiatric and psy-professions. We have to be able to win people over to our side. We have to.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes for comments and discussions. Just a note that okay, just feel free to. I mean, we don't have to only give questions to Ian, but we can just discuss among ourselves just to make it a bit more suggest.
You may
because we're gonna have a panel later and we can discuss it further. But just okay, so I see free questions or comments, or just feel free to react to each other as well.
Yeah, but I still have a question. So my question is about these diagnoses. To what extent do we have to reject them, immediately and totally? Because as you talked about, like homosexuality being taken out of the list of, the list. So it's no longer a diagnosis, but it's still something that people mobilize around in a way, and it's still an identity. But you can also look at it from a critical point of view in this neoliberal world. So I was just wondering, maybe you can elaborate a bit on what you think about diagnosis and, not necessarily as diagnosis, but even just like saying, oh, I have an anxiety disorder, or I am, I am severely depressed.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. In the same way as people took this term that was used as a negative term, black, and adopted it as a proud description of who they were. I'm black. And gay pride being another example. So there are groups involved in the wider mental health movement. There are mad pride groups. People who say, yeah, I'm mad. I'm mad. This world has made me mad, and I'm mad, okay, right. But live with it. I live with it. You live with it. So yes, I agree with you. And I suppose I was kind of like moving in that direction when I was starting to talk about the introverts. You're like, really, I don't believe in the distinction between extroverts and introverts. It's a kind of psychological story. It's a fairy tale. But I do feel like I'm an introvert. It might not seem like that now, but that's because I'm having to sit here and talk to you with a microphone. But most of the time, I avoid people and I hide away and I prefer to read. I'm in that sense, I would claim the term introvert. And different kinds of label give you access to resources. They give you access to ways of community and identity. So what people choose to do with their labels, I think, is up to them. I'm not going to tell people that you're wrong to use that term. Yeah, use whatever term you like, whatever psychiatric kind of connotations it has, as long as you know what you're doing with it. That's the important thing. Did you have a question there?
Thanks for sharing the insights and alternatives in the psychiatry field. My name is Kantari Matulaitytė, and I work with one of the most suicidal groups of people in Lithuania as a self-help group, and that came to provide as well group therapy, which basically opens some doors to people that don't have the access. So mental health services, they're not really accessible to the most in need, right? But I would like to actually maybe ground us a little, because we traveled, through time and different places in the world, and the questions were about the presentation and the content, but I missed some sort of relation to where we are now, and just like, you know, ground ourselves, look around. We are in Lithuania, and I would like to think how you see the mental landscape here, what you know about it, because I would like to believe that it's not the one-way process, right? You come from UK, which is the West. We are, you know, former Soviet and East Europe country. And, you know, talking about inclusivity and empowerment of the local people. And so the question would be that it's not one-way process of learning, right? We also have our wisdom and things to teach. And the other maybe aspect, it's not really a question, but maybe a comment, which is like every structure with over time becomes stagnant. So what are the teachings through history of marginalization within left, and what can be done to renew these structures to include the people that are blind spot? Thanks.
Okay, well that's more of a comment than a question, and a really useful one. Thanks. And in a way, you're doing what you say should be done, which is good. And I have more to learn about what is happening in Lithuania. But there is a little trap here, and the trap is that the professionals, they like to absorb information, and then they like to use it to reinforce their categories. So, for example, in Britain
It's
again.
called appropriation.
Appropriation, yes, okay. We have a tradition in Britain called transcultural psychiatry, and they are well-meaning psychiatrists who want to understand about psychiatric differences in different cultures. I went to a training day of the transcultural psychiatrists, and they were mainly dealing actually with Ukrainian emigres. It was many years ago actually, but and they had particular diagnoses that they made. And the danger is that if you come from a minority community subject to racism, and you go to a transcultural psychiatrist, danger is you can be doubly pathologized, because not only do you get a diagnosis, but if you don't show the kinds of distress that are appropriate to your community, you will be pathologized for that as well. And that's where the appropriation becomes a real danger. So, yes, it's about acknowledging that there are different ways of experiencing the world, and it's about listening to that. So thanks for your question. Thanks.
Thank you so much. One last question. Jürgen had, yeah? Okay, and then we'll have the chance to discuss these topics further because we're going to have a discussion panel on very similar. It will be a continuation, so we can continue our discussion afterwards as well.
So thank you for your lecture. I wanted to ask about, maybe I will be a bit banal, but about physical labor. Maybe you know some kind of, I don't know, maybe you research yourself about this kind of mental health and what you, I guess you spoke about alienation. And then I guess your own life experience, like you saw probably what Facebook was even like all this communication development, also how the labor changed, that it became less physical in a way. So, and maybe, I don't know, there is some practices like, in Soviet Union, there were these things that people would go to dig the potatoes, this bulvakasis, so maybe I'm sarcastic, but maybe there is some kind of things that connect labor, which wouldn't be attached to the need to survive, of course, that it wouldn't be this kind of employment, but like something, yeah, all of this kind of physical labor, or I don't know, creative labor that connects you with others, and I guess with nature as well in some way.
Yeah, I mean, the mental labor that we engage in when we're sitting in front of a computer, writing or answering emails or dealing with Facebook, has physical effects. Bad back, strain, eyes. You only have to talk to secretaries. You only have to talk to people who are working in administration. You only have to talk to people who are involved in these tech companies to see the level of physical pain that they're in as a result of this mental labor that they're doing. Our minds and our bodies are connected. They're not separate things. And we have to find ways of making that link again between our physical activity and our mental activity and our emotional activity, caring activity, linking with other people. We have to find ways of doing that again that makes a connection, the kind of connection that you are asking for. Well, is it collectively preparing the food or setting up the tents and kind of looking after the space? Is that the kind of thing that we do? Yeah, might be. Yeah, and many things that spaces that we can seize back as common spaces where we can learn to be working together again. And again, psychiatry has a term for this because it appropriates everything. When it gets people to engage in basket weaving in hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, it calls it milieu therapy. Very reduced idea of collective activity. But it's that kind of thing. There's a grain of truth in there that we have to find different ways of coordinating what we're doing so that we're actually at one with the world instead of separated from it. Combating alienation together.
We also have social prescribing now.
We'll end here with the very nice last words for now, and we'll have, thank you so much once again. So in 10 minutes, we're going to continue this discussion further. We're going to have a discussion panel called Mental Health as a Social and Political Issue. So please come back, and we'll have 30 minutes to discuss after the panelists, so we'll have lots of space.